This is Debrief, brought to you by the Australian Industry Group.
Welcome to Debrief, the podcast that explains industry to policymakers and government policy to industry, and is driven by the Australian Industry Group's mission, which is to empower industry success for a better Australia. I'm Louise McGrath, Head of Industry Development and Policy, joined by our CEO, Willox. Today's theme is 2025 Australia's Great Productivity Reset. It's been a year of economic uncertainty, regulatory reform and technological acceleration. Ines, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Louise. Great to be with you. It's been a long year.
Been a very long year, but let's start with the big picture. How would you sum up Australia's economic performance in 2025?
Look, unfortunately, it's been a year of stagnation. We haven't really gone forward in any particular way that encourages business to think that we've become a better place to invest and to do business in 2025. It's been a hard year. Well, it was a year punctuated by an election, which of course is a difficult time for business because everything sort of slows down in the months leading up to an election as people stop to think, well, what will happen? What will the policy outcomes be? What will change? What won't? So that's a natural sort of stop point for a lot of business investment. But then, we had a very clear result in the election, but we haven't seen a real pickup in investment, in confidence or employment across the economy. I hesitate to use the word stagnation, but we're probably in a place where we are in a holding pattern. We're neither, advancing as we should be, nor are we going into terminal decline. But the fact that we're just sort of stopped is really worrying because a lot of the rest of the economy is moving forward very quickly around the globe. So we're sort of trailing further and further and becoming less and less competitive as time goes on. And that's where two big issues sort of come together at the end of the year. And we've seen that in the release of the mid-year economic forecast and outlook, which was done in late December, which is that, we are stuck with inflation for a considerable period. It's on the rise. And we see productivity flatlining and continuing to flatline, little bumps of improvement here and there, but nothing structural is occurring to change the dial. So as we end 25 and go into 2026, I think there's a feeling, a little bit of foreboding out there about what's ahead.
And we've done a lot of work in identifying the level of non-market employment, so that sort of government funded. How can we restarting private sector engine of growth is essential, is a quote that you've had during the year. But what are the sort of things that we need to do? Can we ask the government to do to get that engine starting again?
Well, we've gone through this year where about 8 out of 10, 4 out of 5 jobs in the economy are being created in the non-market sector, primarily by the public sector, either through the engagement of public servants or through publicly funded employment. And that, there is a place for that. But that 8 out of 10 is completely out of balance with where we need to be. Historically, we've been running at about 7 out of 10 jobs in Australia being created by the private sector. So you've seen almost a complete flip in the job market as the private sector is being crowded out and is losing the ability and the will in some cases to invest in equipment, but most importantly in people and in employment. One of my things I look back wryly on the year was when we did some data around the Victorian economy, and Victoria is sort of worse than anywhere else when it comes to this, and it's 9 out of 10 jobs are being created in the non-market economy by the public sector, by public sector spending. And the Victorian government said, no, that's not right. It's only 8.6 out of 10. I thought that was probably one of the low points of the year, quite frankly. But what do we have to do here? There is a role for government, and because government sets the conditions under which business operate. We'll obviously go more into that as we talk. But there's a role here for government to enable business investment, to create the conditions for growth, create the conditions for competitiveness and for innovation. And there is some work being done, and I don't think we should diminish that in any way. There is work being done, but it's slow and it's ponderous, and it takes a long time to take effect. So we've got to look at how do we drive productivity? What are the productivity enhancers and enablers? What are the measures that will put downward pressure on inflation? These are sort of things government policymakers need to be looking at, because quite frankly, if we continue with this flatlining, very low productivity, and we continue with inflation, which is now back with a vengeance, if we continue with that, we're going to see real wages decline. We're going to see businesses even more reluctant to invest, and we're going to see conditions where our economy becomes less and less competitive. So what do you have to do? We have to look at how government spends its money, how it allocates its capital, what it focuses on, what policies it puts in place to drive and encourage business investment. They can be short-term or long-term measures. What are the confidence-building measures that government can put in place to encourage business to look forward with some confidence? How do we tackle things like energy, energy cost and reliability, but particularly cost, which is a huge issue for business and for households. Without energy at a reliable price and a ready, steady availability, we're always going to have problems in our economy. How do we build the skills base of the now and the future? The economy in 2026, as we go into a new year, is going to look vastly different to the way it did at the end of 2024, only 12 months ago, with the advent of technologies like artificial intelligence and beyond. So what role does the government play in assisting, the economy and business to skill up? These are what do we do around making our taxation system more competitive for business to invest? Business got to play its part in paying tax. Everyone understands that. But at the moment, we're just simply not competitive. How do we go around stripping out unnecessary and unneeded regulation, which is continuing to grow like topsy and holding business back? More and more business time, board time, worker time is spent on compliance and regulation. How do we sort of fix these problems that we've created for ourselves to create the ground where business can grow and invest, but still have proper boundaries around it and proper rules and regulations and proper legal constructs under which to operate, but let's not strangle them with it. So the bottom line here, Louise, is how do we make our economy more competitive and fit for purpose? Because right at the moment, it's looking neither.
Yeah. I agree. And I think, in terms of regulation, companies want good, pragmatic regulation, because good companies always comply, even if it's bad regulation. The ones that the regulation's trying to capture are ignoring it anyway and are never really suffering from poor or good regulation.
Well, this is the question, right? Where do we focus? And this is what I would ask policymakers. Are we going to take an approach that we're going to regulate everyone on the basis of poor or improper behaviour by 5%? Let's pick a number. And so does everyone get held back because of the actions of a few, or do you just find ways to regulate those poorly behaving businesses out of the market, or to drive them out of the market? That would be much easier to do. I think what we've fallen for is the trap of a one-size-fits-all regulatory approach. There's no sense of trust. There's no sense of good records. There's no sense that business gets rewarded for doing well. It just seems to be more and more heaped upon business that you're guilty until you prove yourself innocent. You're bad until you demonstrate that you are good.
Yeah. Now, as you said, we had the budget and the election. So thinking back earlier in the year, the election delivered a second term for the government, with a bigger majority, though not particularly a high vote count. How do you think that shaped the policy landscape for this year? And then as they go into their second year, what can we expect?
Well, from dealing and working with government since May, there's a couple of things. Firstly, the day after the election, it was absolutely wonderful to hear the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, come out and say that productivity has to be a focus. And that was incredibly positive to hear that message. Of course, then we had to have conversations to work out that we were both, government and business talking the same language when it came to productivity. But to have, it was almost like a persona non grata, if you can just have a word that described that way in the lead up to the election. But it's emerged into the light, which is a positive thing. Then we had the productivity or economic roundtable. We can have the semantic argument around what it was called, but it did in the end have a very strong focus on productivity and economic enhancement. So that's positive. And there's a lot of measures that have come out of that have been short term that are still working through. These things take time. I think we all have to be real on this. And then there are some medium term measures and some longer term measures, which will take the entirety of this term of government and probably beyond to work through. The fact that the opposition, Ted O'Brien, the Shadow Treasurer, was in the room was a fantastic positive. Yes, there were a few arguments in the room, but that's politics. But the fact that he was there was very, very helpful, and credit to the government for having him there and credit for him for turning up, because it gave both sides an insight into what different constituencies were focused on, what they were thinking, and their willingness to address the problems. Nobody was shying away from the problems, and that was a positive thing. So we had a couple of things. So there was short-term measures around trade and trade measures, which were positive. There's some longer-term work being done around tax. There's work, being undertaken. We'd like it faster, but there's work being undertaken on regulatory reform. Two of the main things that came out were determination to pass the legislation around environmental protections and biodiversity controls. That got passed in the Parliament in the last week of Parliament. We're now in a consultation process around that, but that will be crucial if we get it right, and we must, to enhancing the approvals process for critical projects for the economy. And that's everything from mines to clean energy to housing and everything else you can think of in between. And that's going to drive productivity. And secondly, now we have the government has frozen the National Construction Code, which was being renewed every 3 years, and just a massive blocker for development, and now has an inquiry underway into what to do with the National Construction Code. And I think that's reporting by early February. That's a positive thing. And look, these things take time. There's always the expectation, when you have a meeting of this sort, well, hang on, things are going to change tomorrow. Very rarely do they do. It takes time, but that was really positive. So the government gets from us a big tick on that. In other cases, the government's been really focused on implementing its election agenda, what it was elected, the policies on which it was elected, and have been working that through. To be frank, we're nearly getting to the end of that process now. So the question then is, what's next for government? I think clearly the next big measure is going to be, the big step will be in the budget in mid-May of 2026. And that really has to lay the groundwork for new vision, new ideas around how to drive the economy forward. When you've ended the year with the Governor of the Reserve Bank, Michelle Bullock, telling everyone we're in for 5 years of hard grind, probably high inflation, difficult economic times, we can't sit around on our hands, because relative living standards will decline, business conditions will decline. So now that the government's done a lot of its sort of election commitment work, the question is, what's next? And that's where the test will really be.
Well, we'll come back after this break, Ines, and try to work out what is next. Energy, technology, workplace relations. Anyway, we'll get into that after the break.
You're listening to the Debrief Podcast, brought to you by the Australian Industry Group. To find out more about how Australian Industry Group can help your business, visit australianindustry.group.com.au.
And welcome back to Debrief. I'm talking to Ines Willox, thinking about the year in review. Net zero and energy really dominated a lot of the media this year, particularly for a lot of our members trying to grapple with high energy costs and understanding where they were in this transition. We had the targets, we've had various funding mechanisms and approvals, as you say, EPBC approvals that all dominated the headlines. The emissions reduction target by 2030, how do you think, we've already spoken to Tennant about that on another episode, but how do you think that's going to be tackled by industry going forward?
So we have two targets now. We really have the 2030 target, 43%. We have the 2035 target, which is 62 to 70%. So we now sort of have two horizons to work to at the moment. And, it's not required that we hit one to hit the other. I think, if we don't hit 43%, that doesn't mean that we're not going to reach 62%. But if we exceed 43%, doesn't mean that we should go above 62% either. Straight after the election, I did another sort of podcast with David Spears from the Insiders, and his first question was about net zero, and the Prime Minister has taken great glee in repeating ad nauseum, and fair enough, what I said on that podcast, which was, should we change our our net zero ambitions, 2050 and emissions targets? And I said, oh God, no. And that comes from the fact that, business and Australian Industry Group has been at the forefront of this debate and discussion on behalf of business now for 20 years. It's been a 20-year journey to get to where we are now. And if we were to sort of go off track from that ambition, it's very much starting again. And then the coalition had their discussions around net zero and came to a different position, which is fine. And they now have to argue the case, make the case, why we should abandon net zero by 2050. If that's actually what they're proposing, because it's still unclear. There's a lot of detail in what they're proposing to fill in. Who are they going to benchmark themselves against? Is it going to be retrospective or prospective? What are they going to do with government subsidies? All of these sort of issues, a lot to work through. And it's fine. It's part of the debate. But our concern is that we had political agreement since 2021 from both major parties around the ambition of net zero by 2050. So business industry could set policy and their approach based on that policy. Now there's been another element of uncertainty injected in here. And people have different views about net zero. There are net zero zealots on both sides of the equation. And we get that difference of view among our membership, depending on where businesses are at in the investment cycle, depending on what industry or what sector they're in. We take the view overall that if we don't make progress on this, two things. One, we'll be punished internationally by those who do, and we won't get any thanks for walking away from it. And two, it will create uncertainty around business investment. And we've always been why not all of the above? Why not more gas? Why not, if we have to keep coal-fired power stations operating longer than they need to to have reliability in the system, why not develop renewables? Why not try different forms of renewables, but do that on a sensible basis? The fact is that the energy debate is now fated to be with us forever through until 2050 and beyond. that as we make the transition, different businesses will approach it in different ways. What we want, though, what we would ask is that all sides of politics come to some basic agreements, and we can always have debates around how to climb the mountain, but let's agree the mountain is there. And then we also need the states to stay on board and not go off like Brown's cows, as they did back in 2007-8 on renewable energy targets, which has completely messed up investment by business. So the big issue business is facing right now is cost of energy. Gas at $12, $14 a gigajoule. That's not sustainable for business in the longer term in investment. Are we rolling out renewables projects fast enough? Are we building enough? Have we built social license? All of these issues we're going to have to address. But if we're not addressing them now, these are 10, 12-year projects. If we're not addressing them now, we are consigning ourselves to energy misery for the next decade, at least.
Yeah. And as you say, certainty gives confidence in investment. And I'll just quote our technology report from last year when we asked companies, have you invested in net zero technology? Barely 50% had. And the reason why they hadn't was because of the regulatory uncertainty and the uncertainty in targets and the framework. So there are real impacts on business.
That's right. And business is not going to invest when they know that the dollar they invest could be flushed down the drain with the stroke of a pen. They want rigor and certainty around policy settings so that they are able to invest. As I said, these are long-term projects and they take a long time to be built. They take a long time to monetize for business. They need that longer-term certainty. And in a way, we sort of went down a cul-de-sac in the last election with the debate around nuclear framed as it was. And again, that held business back. We said in the lead up to the election and after the election, perhaps the best thing could have been to do and to not rule out nuclear, but the best thing to do would be to lift the moratorium on nuclear, to make that the first step. And then if there is a market there, business will invest. And what governments have got to do is create, this, as always, the circumstances where business feels confident enough to invest.
Yeah. But one area where our members are investing is in artificial intelligence, and it's really moved from hype to reality. What stood out for you on AI?
Well, that's what I was referring to earlier in the podcast, Louise, about the end of 24 being very, very different to the start of 26. And where that big difference is in technology and the adaptation of technology. Business is, we did a lot of work on artificial intelligence with our members this year. And in fact, in recent times, I've had a couple of conversations with the ACTU and the Minister for Workplace Relations around artificial intelligence in the workplace. Business is still working this through. So is government, so is regulators, so are unions and their workforce. So we're still in the new at the moment. But there's a couple of things that stand out. Business is using artificial intelligence, but not in ways that perhaps business would automatically think. We did this report, which I'd recommend to everyone reading, on how artificial intelligence is used in the workplace, using six companies as case studies on how they're using it. They're all using it in different ways, in different forms, in different fashions, and for different needs. And they're trying things out. One of the big things that stood out for me was the use of AI to improve safety outcomes. I think that's invaluable. There is no sign that businesses, the broad Australian business base, is using or thinking of using artificial intelligence as a job replacement. It's being looked at as a job enabler. I have not come across one member company who says, I'm going to implement artificial intelligence and I'm going to do it so I can wipe out my workforce. That is just not how business is thinking. What they are thinking, though, is this can improve my processes, my procedures, make my business more efficient, create more opportunities for growth. make my workplace safer. And there's also a growing realisation, although we've been relatively slow adopters in recent years of what has come to be known as artificial intelligence, there is sort of evidence emerging that the pace is being picked up, and there's a growing realisation that if I'm not looking at and using artificial intelligence in my workplace in a coordinated, constructive, cohesive way, then I'm going to get taken out by a business that does, because they're more efficient, they're thinking more broadly, they're faster, they're more connected to the customer, they're more connected to their market, and they are able to do things using artificial intelligence to grow and expand their business. So I think going into 26, we're still at a point of being uncertain about exactly where this will take us. But that's exciting in its own way. But we're also at the point where businesses are becoming more confident either to use it or to experiment with it. And I think through 26 we'll see, I think, a quite significant uplift and uptick in the use of artificial intelligence in Australian businesses. Their customers demand it, their supply chains are demanding it, and their competitors are forcing it on them.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the government's announcement that we're not going to be doing a special regulatory regime for artificial intelligence, that the Safety Institute will be there, that will work with regulators to see, if it's necessary. But I think, our legal system is technology neutral today, and I think that's where it should be in the future. And I think that will give companies a lot of confidence.
Yeah, I think the government deserves a lot of credit here. I think, quite frankly, it could have been very easy for them to be spooked by artificial intelligence, very easy for them to slam down the hard hand of regulation on the use of artificial intelligence. And they have chosen not to. I think in large part, that's because within the public sector themselves, there's a greater uptake in the use of artificial intelligence than they ever expected. And so they've seen it at work within their own workplace. I don't think things are settled here. I think, there's always the prospect of regulation coming, and we should always be alert to that. But this is evolving. This is not the finished product. And the government's taken the stance, I think, and they deserve a lot of, recognition for this, that, we'll watch this evolve, we'll help shape it, but we don't know where it'll go. There's no big AI plan either that government has or that business has. Every business is doing it differently and looking at it differently. I think, there's little things though that are emerging in conversations, like unions who also have the ear of government are they could have made life very difficult too, but they haven't. And I think they overall, and I think they deserve recognition for that as well. But there's things like, how is AI used? What's the connection with the workforce? What's the consultation with the workforce? Is it being properly explained to the workforce? These are legitimate questions. And I think that's where the focus will be in a business sense. If you are using and adopting and taking up artificial intelligence, how broadly are you consulting? That doesn't mean you're seeking a yes or a no or giving anyone a veto right, but how broadly are you consulting with your workforce to explain to them what is happening and why? I think that's where a lot of the focus will be as we go into 2026.
Yeah, but as it would with any best practice for change management and getting things on.
Absolutely, and that's the point of the conversation. When you think of rostering, for example, using artificial intelligence to roster, the question is asked, well, are you consulting with your workforce when you're doing those rosters, and what are the rationales for doing, making decisions A, B and C? Well, they're easily explained by what you're putting into artificial intelligence. And the riposte to it is, well, it's no different from using a spreadsheet or any of the existing technology tools to do rostering, for instance. It's no different, but it's more efficient. And that's the issue here. And I think they're the questions that will be asked, and the answers will be expected. I think they're easily asked and they're easily answered by business if they do it properly.
But I think one of the inhibitors for AI will come down to skills and workforce. CET have done a lot of work, looking at skills shortages, what we can do to reform the training system, but in particular on apprenticeships. That was a recurring theme this year. Do we think the current programs are meeting industry needs to drive that uptake that we need for the future workforce?
No. We are really concerned about where we are in terms of the development of skills right across the economy. So when you think about, we'll just focus on artificial intelligence. It's not technology companies we're focused on here. It's businesses every day who are using artificial intelligence. So there's a couple of questions. How that are being worked through. There's no simple answer yet. How do you upskill your existing workforce to use and adopt artificial intelligence? And then how do you skill the incoming workforce? And they're two separate questions that will require two different answers. When it comes to apprentices, an apprenticeship in 2026 is going to look vastly different to an apprenticeship in 2020, let alone 2015, let alone 1986, to pick a year. So we have to upgrade what is being taught in the apprenticeship system, what skills are being passed on, and that goes to then do businesses and providers like TAFE and other private providers. Do they have the skills and the ability to pass on and to those skills that are going to be required? Because we're all learning here. There's questions around apprenticeships from the sense of more and more sort of what are called mature age apprentices are now entering the system. People have had one career and now coming back to do a trade. Mature age in this case is sort of 22 years old. But how do they get treated? Do they need to do the whole full 4-year apprenticeship? What sort of competencies are involved for them? How do we get them through the system quicker, faster, so that they're more productive? I think trying to tie the two together, artificial intelligence is going to shake up completely how we do training and how we do apprenticeships and how we do traineeships to make them fit for purpose, because what we did 10 years ago isn't going to cut it in the new world.
I was speaking to a member who very, very high-tech produces product for the defence sector that is AI is embedded all throughout it. And he said to me he loves Salesforce because Salesforce automatically has AI tools to look at what the best salesman is doing and train the others. And he says engineers, similarly, that technology, they can see who's the best engineer. He said, but the people on the shop floor, the most valuable person, to take them off to do training for a couple of hours or, a day, that's a loss of productivity. He wishes he had an AI solution where they could observe the best performer on the shop floor and then train, apprentices or whomever.
I think that's right. Through AI, I think everyone will get lifted up, I think. And I think from all the research that I've seen, by our Centre for Education and Training, but also outside internationally and the like, is the biggest uplift comes from what I may call the lower skilled workers in relative terms, because they get lifted right up through the use of artificial intelligence. And once they learn the skills to work with it, their working lives are changed, and that impacts on the productivity of enterprises as well. So I think it's going to be totally transformative in the way that we do business, that we think about business, that we teach people to do business, that we interact with each other. I'm very positive on it, but I'm open-eyed. Of course, we have to be clear. Of course, there will be some job loss and there'll be quite significant job change. But every technological transformation that we've had through history has created employment, and that's what we need to remember.
Now, in terms of employment, another issue that's dominated a lot of our members' life this year has been workplace relations in terms of the wage case outcome, multi-employer bargaining changes, and a few other things. They've really shaped the cost environment. Do you think members are now grappling with these? Are they getting on top of them? And do we expect any more reform in the new year?
I think two things. Businesses adapting to the change, massive change that has been visited upon Australian workplaces since December 2022, after the first infamous Jobs and Skills Summit in the September of that year. There's been enormous change in that time that businesses have had to adapt to, but are continuing to adapt to. I think it's one of these things, and people say to me, "Oh, but see, nothing's happened." Well, a lot has happened, but business is more adaptable than people think. It's the old "tell me the rules and I'll make it work." So they're trying their best to make it work, but a lot of this is still unfolding. You mentioned multi-party bargaining. That is still now that is now, only now, through the back half of 2025, going into 2026, rolling its way through the courts and the Workplace Commission. It takes a long time for these to happen, the way that, so you pick multi-party bargaining. Businesses operate on usually three-year rolling enterprise agreements. So they don't all come up at the same time on the same date. It's not like a horse's birthday. Everything happens on the one day. It takes a long time for them to roll through. It takes time for the unions to work out how they want to use the law, and they're starting to use it. They're using it in the childcare sector. They're using it in the retail sector. They're using it in the mining sector, transportation sector. All of that is now starting to roll out. And I think, you asked me, looking ahead, 2026, I think 2026 will be the year when we see the full impact of the multi-party bargaining laws start to take effect, because it is now 3 years beyond from when it first got implemented. I think you'll see an enormous amount of union activity in this space in 2026, where, you've seen the electrical union try to roll up every electrical employer in New South Wales because there's a geographic connection. Hey, they're in the one state. All of this is going to play out through 2026. And I think, IR, although business has sort of got used to it, and it's going to hit with a bit of a sledgehammer next year.
Yeah. And I think with all these changes, there's often a hidden opportunity cost. As you say, companies adapt, but that means they're choosing not to focus on something perhaps more productivity enhancing, or, developing a new product, going to a new market. There's always choices that have to be made with limited resources.
Well, that's right. And this sort of goes to the broader question of compliance. The businesses are trying to comply with the law. They have to, but they're having to make a huge effort to do that. And that's at huge cost to the business. And it means that the business is focused on adaptation rather than on growing. And that's a problem for the economy as a whole. And that plays back into the productivity equation. One thing to look at going into next year is, well, how do the unions, we talked about AI before, but what sort of access do they want into workplaces to see how AI is being used and utilised? That's going to be a big question. I think you'd be wise to keep your eye on that one going into next year. But, we've seen still some activity this year from the government, and they got elected on the platform to do it. So we've done a lot of work with government around the implementation of some of the measures that they took to the last election, around penalty rates, legislating penalty rates, around non-compete clauses. That's being worked through at the moment, around legislation on what are called reproductive rights, which is the rights of parents after a child there's been a stillbirth in the family. They've got a lot of understanding from business around that. And of course, this payday super comes into effect next year, which is a massive disruptor for business. Rather than having to pay superannuation quarterly, it has to be paid on the pay cycle. It'll be very complicated, and for smaller businesses will present quite significant cash flow problems. We've made government well aware of that. And through our conversations with them, they understand it. So now businesses will have 7 business days to make sure the money goes into the account. But it's still going to be a big issue for business. And the ATO is the one sort of overseeing this. So, if you deal with the ATO, they don't hold back.
Yeah. All right. Well, we better stop there, Ines. Thanks for this sort of review. I think it's given us a good understanding of where we're going for the next year. Now, we started the year all distracted by the fact that Jim Chalmers had read this book, Abundance. So we wait to see what he reads over this summer. I know you're a great...
He does a lot over summer holidays, the Treasurer. He writes long essays or he reads long books.
Yes.
And they become the guiding light
I know.
for the year. I remember in the middle of the year, you couldn't get a copy of Abundance, and then there was an abundance of abundances in bookshops. And now it seems to have disappeared again. But some of the lessons in that book that government and people on the political left picked up, I've got to say, quite frankly, to people in business were like as plain as the nose on your face, that's how you should operate. But I'm glad the Treasurer read it. I'm glad others read it too, because it sort of has made government think about how it allocates capital and the outcomes it expects from that capital. And I think that'll be, just because the Treasurer read a book in Christmas 2024 doesn't mean that the lessons from that can't continue to be learnt right through 2026.
Well, I as you know, read it and struggled through it. Like, it was quite long and repetitive. But anyway, I think the last third was the most useful in terms of thinking about invention and technology. And I don't know enough people got that far. So perhaps if people haven't read it, they could revisit it.
I think that's a good way, and that's what maybe people can read between Christmas and New Year for brain food, is to reread the last bit of Abundance again, because I do think a lot of people read the first bit and thought, yeah, right, or they thought, wow, this is new, and didn't get really beyond that. But the stories in there about the need for invention, reinvention, technological growth, innovation, that's how economies grow. They grow through trial and error, and that's the atmosphere and the circumstance we need to encourage going into 2026. And that's why in the early 2026, I'll be interested what Jim Chalmers reads, but I'm going to be as much interested in what Tim Ayres reads, the industry minister, over Christmas, as he's taken away the report into the future of research and development in Australia to read over Christmas and then come back in the new year. I think that's going to be one of the most important government documents into the new year to watch.
Yeah, I agree. But do you have any book recommendations for the summer for people heading off on holidays?
Well, I during the year I read Founders Forge by Arthur Herman, an old book from about 2011, but it's about how the American economy through the late 30s and then into World War II industrialised, essentially. It turned itself, although it had an industrial base, it turned itself into a serious industrial economy in that time, driven by American industrialists at the time. I read it on the basis that I was thinking about the future of our defence industry as we go into, where we get to with AUKUS Pillar 1 and AUKUS Pillar 2. I think that is a great book, well worth reading. If you want to know, how we can step up, that's a great book to read. It's a little bit redolent of the Australian experience with Essington Lewis at the same time, and Lord Beaverbrook in the UK with aircraft production. It just tells you when you actually want to do something and you have to do something, we can find ways to do it. So that just tells me we just got to get some urgency into this equation. And it's urgency we don't have. So I'd recommend that. It's a terrific read. I know a lot of people in defence have taken to reading it as well, and hope the lessons get learned.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to recommend 2 Japanese books because, Japan's now our number 1 tourist destination for Australians. But I wonder how well we know Japan. And I think with the new Prime Minister, she's getting much more bullish and muscly in the region. So I'd recommend 2 books, Before the Coffee Gets Cold, and What You Are Looking For is in the Library. I won't attempt to read to say their authors' names because I'll mispronounce them, but easily found really good insights into just thinking of the nuance of all the different experiences of being Japanese. We think of them all as worker bees. There are plenty suffering from ennui, just as there are in, millennials in Australia. So I think it's always good to read these books that are just give you that experience of what it's like to be in the country. And I think might embellish our experience and understanding of our neighbours in Japan.
Japan's back, I think.
I think so too. Yeah, very much.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Ines. And that's all we've got time for. So what we're going to do over summer is release some recordings of our panel discussions when we release the report that Ines mentioned earlier about the use cases in AI. So we had a fantastic event at the Press Club in Canberra in November. So not everyone could get there and not everyone could fit in the room. So we've recorded it, and that way you can enjoy these really useful and instructive conversations over summer as we move into the new year thinking about AI adoption. So thank you very much for your listening this year. Please subscribe on your podcast if you found us through the website. And always you can email us on industry.policy@australianindustrygroup.com.au. And we'll speak next year. Thanks.
Thanks, Louise. Thanks, everyone. Have a great break.